1 year ago, KTM was flat broke. Employees unpaid, suppliers unpaid, production lines silent, and a 100-year-old motorcycle brand staring at the real possibility it wouldn't survive 2025. Then, on July 28, 2025, the factory in Mattighofen, Austria, fired back up. At the time, a lot of people, including us, treated that restart with suspicion because a factory turning back on doesn't undo the damage that got it shut down in the first place. So we're not asking whether KTM restarted. We already know that happened. We're asking the harder question, a year later, with real financial statements to check instead of a press release to guess from. Did it actually work? Every number in this video comes from KTM's own quarterly filings under its new parent company, Bajaj Mobility AG, plus independent trade press coverage. Let's go through it. First, a quick reminder of exactly how bad things got, because you need the starting point to judge the recovery honestly. According to Adventure Rider, KTM's financial trouble was already known at the EICMA motorcycle show in November 2024 when the company announced a list of new 2025 models it was, at the time, in no real position to build. By winter, according to that same Adventure Rider reporting, KTM AG, which at that point also controlled Husqvarna, Gas, and MV Agusta, was effectively bust, with employees, parts suppliers, and material suppliers all left unpaid. Production stayed dark for months. The restart itself, when it came, was reported by multiple outlets on the same day. Visordown reported that KTM restarted production at its main Mattighofen factory on July 28, 2025, returning to a full 5-day work week after a months-long shutdown triggered by what the outlet described as serious financial headwinds. A DV Pulse reported that the company reignited all 4 of its production lines across its Mattighofen and Munderfing facilities, bringing roughly 1,000 employees back to work. KTM's own CEO at the time, Gottfried Neumeister, was quoted by Motocross Action magazine, thanking employees directly for what he called their dedication, flexibility, and team spirit through what he described as one of the company's most challenging phases. That's the moment our original video would have covered. And on its own, a press release and some employees back on a factory floor genuinely isn't proof of anything. So what happened after that is the actual story. The first real proof point isn't a sales number, it's a change of ownership, because that's what actually stabilized the company's finances. Multiple 2026 sources, including motorcycle.com, confirmed that KTM's parent company was renamed from Bajaj Mobility AG to Bajaj Mobility AG, reflecting Indian manufacturer Bajaj Auto becoming the new majority owner. According to a detailed report from ElectroIQ.com's KTM statistics breakdown, sourced from KTM's own annual report, the company recorded a large one-time restructuring gain of 1.193 billion euros in 2025, a gain generated, according to Australian outlet MC News, largely because creditors agreed to accept only 30% of their registered claims. In plain terms, KTM didn't earn its way back to solvency in 2025. It got there because the people it owed money to agreed to be paid back 30 cents on the dollar, and a new owner stepped in with fresh capital. That's a real rescue, but it's not the same thing as a healthy business, which is exactly why checking the numbers a year later matters more than the restart headline itself did. Now, here's the actual 2025 damage, in full, before we get to the recovery, because you can't judge a turnaround without knowing how far the company actually fell. According to ElectroIQ.com's compiled statistics, KTM Group's total vehicle sales fell 31.5% year-over-year in 2025, from 402,175 units in 2024 down to 275,593. Motorcycle sales specifically, across the KTM, Husqvarna, and Gas brands, dropped 42.5% to 126,822 units. That same report notes KTM's own motorcycle-specific revenue fell from 1.88 billion euros in 2024 to roughly 1.35 billion euros in 2025. So, going into 2026, the company wasn't just recovering from a shutdown, it was recovering from a genuinely brutal collapse year. On every metric, across every product line. So does the Q1 2026 data show a real turnaround? or just a low bar being cleared? Let's look at the actual filing. According to KTM AG's own Q1 2026 report, as covered directly by motorcycle.com, the company sold 40,332 motorcycles across the KTM, Husqvarna, and GasGas brands in the first quarter of 2026, up 125.1% from 17,915 units in the same quarter of 2025. Motorcycle segment revenue jumped from 108.3 million euros to 272.4 million euros, a rise of 151.6%, according to the same filing, as reported by Kaiwav's independent analysis. Group revenue overall rose 70.2%. According to industry outlet BRM, the profitability numbers matter even more than the sales numbers here. Per motorcycle.com's direct reporting on the filing, KTM's operating result, EBIT, improved by 65.5 million euros, moving from a loss of 91.6 million euros in Q1 2025 to a loss of 26.1 million euros in Q1 2026, a 71.5% improvement. EBITDA turned positive for the first time in years, landing at 5.5 million euros, compared to a negative 55.8 million euros in the same quarter a year earlier. KTM AG's own CFO, Petra Preining, was quoted directly in that filing. The significant increase in motorcycle sales and the positive EBITDA prove that our operational realignment is taking effect. At the same time, we have sustainably strengthened our financial stability with the refinancing and created the basis for profitable growth. That's not a marketing quote pulled from a press release about the restart. That's a CFO speaking to a completed quarterly financial filing, which is a much higher bar of accountability. Speaking of that refinancing Preining mentioned, it's a real documented event, not a vague claim. Motorcycle.com reported that in February 2026, KTM AG completed a 550 million euro refinancing deal with an international banking consortium made up of JP Morgan SE, HSBC, DBS Bank Limited, and MUFG Bank. 473 million euros of that new loan went straight to repaying Bajaj Auto International Holdings' original restructuring loan. That's KTM replacing emergency rescue debt from its own new owner with a conventional 5-year commercial loan from major global banks, which is generally read in corporate finance as a sign lenders believe the company can actually service its debt going forward, not just survive quarter to quarter. By Q2 2026, the pattern held rather than fading, which is the real test of whether Q1 was a fluke or a trend. According to Australian outlet MC News, citing Bajaj Mobility's preliminary Q2 figures, KTM, Husqvarna, and GasGas sold 48,672 motorcycles outside India during the quarter, a 71% increase over the 28,471 units sold in the heavily disrupted second quarter of 2025, and a 21% improvement over Q1 2026 itself. Group revenue for the quarter came in around 370 million euros, up from 231 million euros a year earlier. And critically, MC News reported an EBITDA margin of approximately 8.7% for the quarter, compared to a negative 55.6% margin in the same quarter of 2025. That outlet specifically flagged that this Q2 EBITDA figure excludes the one-time restructuring gain that boosted the 2025 annual results, meaning it's a cleaner read on whether the actual motorcycle business is making money again, separate from the accounting rescue. First half of 2026 totals, per that same MC News report. Worldwide motorcycle sales of 147,572 units, up 81%, and motorcycle segment revenue of roughly 700 million euros, up from 373 million euros in the first half of 2025. So on the pure numbers, the answer to did the restart work is a genuine yes. 2 consecutive quarters of major sales growth, AI return to positive operating profitability, and a completed refinancing on commercial terms. But a fair verdict has to include what hasn't fully healed, and there's real substance here too, not just a caveat for balance. Start with the debt. According to German outlet MX News Online's coverage of the Q1 2026 results, Bajaj Mobility still posted a net loss of 35 million euros for the quarter, smaller than the year before. But still a loss, not a profit. Net debt stood at approximately 837 million euros as of the end of Q1 2026, and the company's equity ratio, a measure of how much of the business is funded by actual ownership stake versus borrowed money, sat at just 22.2%. For comparison, a healthy, low-risk industrial company typically runs an equity ratio well above 30%. KTM is still leaning heavily on debt to operate, even after shedding a huge chunk of it through the creditor haircut and refinancing. Then there's the workforce. Motorcycle.com's Q1 2026 reporting confirmed that KTM initiated a reduction of 500 employees during the quarter, concentrated mainly in middle management and white-collar roles, with that process expected to wrap up by the third quarter of 2026. That's not the production floor workforce that came back in July 2025. It's a separate, newer round of cuts, on top of the earlier crisis, aimed at trimming corporate overhead as the company restructures under Bajaj's ownership. Dealer confidence is the piece that's hardest to measure with a clean number, but multiple sources flag it directly. Kaiwav's independent analysis, after checking the underlying filings itself, concluded the core recovery claim is accurate, but added a specific caution. Many dealers spent the last 2 years dealing with oversupply and discounting pressure, and that kind of trust doesn't rebuild as fast as a balance sheet does. New Zealand outlet BRM's coverage of the Q1 results made a similar point about geography specifically. Retail sales remain uneven across certain markets, with Europe, KTM's home turf, still trailing Q1 2025 figures by roughly 1,000 units, even as global numbers surged. So the recovery is real, but it isn't evenly distributed yet. And the dealer network that watched the company nearly collapse is, understandably, taking longer to fully retrust it than the accountants took to fix the balance sheet. There's also a strategic shift worth naming, because it's part of how the recovery actually happened, not just a side note. According to New Zealand outlet BRM, KTM streamlined its operations by fully exiting businesses outside its core motorcycle focus, including its e-bicycle division and the Expo sports car program, and scaled back partnerships and investment arrangements involving CF Moto and MV Agusta that no longer fit the company's direction. In other words, part of the recovery is KTM becoming a smaller, more focused company than it was before the crisis, not simply the old KTM bouncing back to its old size. New leadership followed the same logic. Stefan Reif stepped in as Chief Commercial Officer on April 1st, 2026, according to the iamabiker.com report on the Q1 filing, with new vice presidents appointed for European and international sales in May, specifically to address the commercial and dealer trust side of the business that the financial restructuring alone couldn't fix. On the product side, KTM leaned into what it's always been best at, rather than trying to prove something everywhere at once. German outlet MX News Online reported that KTM presented 8 new models in the first quarter of 2026 alone, including a new 990 RCR track variant, along with further updates to the Duke and Adventure lineups. On the racing side, that same report noted KTM continued its motorsport push through 2026, and iamabiker.com specifically flagged that rider Luciano Benavides secured KTM's 21st Dakar Rally title during the season. A reminder that whatever was happening on the balance sheet, KTM didn't step back from the competitive presence that's always been central to how the brand sells itself to serious riders. So, 1 year later, here's the honest verdict, weighing everything above rather than picking one side of it. The restart in July 2025 was real, but on its own it proved almost nothing, which is exactly the skepticism it deserved at the time. What actually saved KTM wasn't the factory turning back on. It was a new majority owner in Bajaj Auto, a creditor haircut that wiped out most of what the company owed, and a commercial refinancing completed 7 months later that put the business on normal financial footing for the first time in over a year. Layered on top of that foundation, 2 consecutive quarters of real sales growth, a swing to positive operating profitability, and a leaner, more focused product lineup all point to a genuine operational recovery, not just an accounting trick. Since Q2's numbers held up even after stripping out the one-time restructuring gain that flattered the 2025 annual results. What's still unresolved? The company remains carrying roughly 837 million euros in net debt on a thin 22% equity base. European Dealer Trust hasn't fully caught up to the improved numbers. And 500 more job cuts are still working their way through the organization as of this recording. So did the restart work? By itself, no. A factory turning back on was never going to be the thing that saved KTM, and anyone who told you otherwise back in July 2025 was reading a press release, not a balance sheet. But everything KTM built on top of that restart over the following 12 months, the ownership change, the creditor deal, the refinancing, and 2 straight quarters of real audited sales and profit growth, adds up to a recovery that the numbers back up as genuine, even with real risk still sitting on the balance sheet. Every figure in this video traces back to KTM's own quarterly filings under Bajaj Mobility AG, plus independent reporting from motorcycle.com, MC News, Visor Down, ADV Pulse, Motocross Action Magazine, Adventure Rider, KaiWav, BRM, MX News-Online, and ElectroIQ.com's compiled statistics. So if you want to check any of it yourself, the paper trail is public. Drop a comment on whether you think KTM fully earns its way back to where it was before the crisis. And subscribe if you want the follow-up the day the next quarterly filing lands.